The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to stop an entire courtroom from breathing. Emily Carter stood frozen, one hand instinctively resting over her 8-month pregnant belly, her eyes fixed somewhere past the rows of polished wooden benches as if reality had briefly slipped out of reach. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the attorneys, not the spectators, not even the court reporter whose fingers hovered above the keys like time itself had hesitated. Because what had just happened wasn't supposed to happen here, not in a place built on order and control, and yet the tension in the air felt thicker than the walls could contain, like something inevitable had just begun. Stay with me, because this is the moment everything changed, the moment millions would later rewind, replay, and dissect frame by frame. Calling it the instant justice finally found its way into a room that had been tilted against her from the very beginning. Just 10 minutes earlier, Emily had walked through those heavy courthouse doors alone, her steps measured, careful, not just because of the weight she carried, but because every eye that turned toward her seemed to carry judgment already formed. Whispers trailing behind her like shadows she couldn't outrun, and the fluorescent lights above cast a sterile glow that made everything feel colder than it should have been, as if warmth itself had been filtered out of the building. At 29 years old, Emily had learned how to make herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable, especially over the past year, especially since Richard Hayes had decided she no longer fit into the version of his life he was building, a life that now included Vanessa Cole, who sat across the room with perfect posture and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, her designer heels crossed neatly, her presence sharp and deliberate like she belonged there more than Emily ever could. Richard stood beside her, checking his watch, adjusting his cufflinks, every movement precise, controlled, as if this hearing were just another meeting on his schedule, another problem to manage, and not the unraveling of a marriage that Emily had once believed was unbreakable. The judge had not yet entered, but the atmosphere already felt like a verdict had been decided long ago, and Emily could feel it pressing against her chest, tightening with each breath, her fingers curling slightly as the baby shifted within her, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone, even if it felt like the entire room had already chosen sides. Vanessa leaned forward then, her voice low but perfectly audible, just enough to land where it needed to, her words carrying that polished cruelty that didn't need volume to cut. And Emily didn't respond, not immediately, because she had learned that silence could sometimes hold more power than anything she could say. But even silence has a breaking point, and somewhere beneath the calm surface she had built so carefully, something was beginning to crack, something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for this exact moment. And then the courtroom doors opened again, a sharp shift in energy rippling through the room as a new presence stepped inside, unexpected, deliberate, and carrying something far more dangerous than anger, truth, the kind that doesn't ask for permission before it changes everything. The man who stepped through the doorway did not raise his voice, and yet the entire room seemed to shift around him as if something invisible had just tilted the balance. His presence calm but undeniable, the kind that made people look twice without knowing why, and Emily felt it before she even turned, that subtle change in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm, her fingers tightening slightly over her belly as her eyes moved toward the entrance where Daniel Brooks stood, his suit simple but precise, his expression unreadable except for the quiet certainty in his eyes. He did not rush, he did not hesitate. He walked forward with measured steps that echoed softly across the marble floor, each one cutting through the tension that had been building since Emily entered the room. And for the first time that morning, Richard Hayes looked up from his watch with something close to irritation, his gaze narrowing as he tried to place the interruption, because this was not part of his plan, not part of the controlled narrative he had constructed so carefully. Vanessa shifted in her seat, her posture still perfect but her smile tightening just slightly at the edges, as if she sensed that something had slipped beyond her control, something she could not dismiss with a single comment or a dismissive glance. Daniel stopped a few feet from Emily, not close enough to overwhelm her, but close enough to signal alignment. And when he spoke, his voice carried clearly without force, steady and grounded, the kind that did not need volume to command attention. Your Honor will want to see this before proceedings continue. And even without the judge present, the statement landed like a quiet disruption, the kind that demanded space. Emily blinked once, her breath catching for a fraction of a second, because this was not how she expected the morning to unfold, not after weeks of silence, not after being told there was nothing left to fight with, nothing left to prove. And yet here it was, something tangible, something real, something that shifted the narrative in a way she had not dared to imagine. Across the room, Richard let out a short breath, controlled but edged with impatience. Stepping forward slightly as if to reassert authority, his voice measured but firm. "This is highly irregular," he said, each word chosen carefully, as though precision alone could restore control. But Daniel did not turn toward him immediately, did not acknowledge the interruption, because control was no longer something that could be reclaimed through tone or posture alone. Instead, Daniel placed a slim folder on the front table, the sound soft but deliberate, and opened it with a practiced motion that revealed a series of documents, neatly organized, each page aligned with a level of care that suggested preparation, not improvisation. And that was the moment Vanessa's composure flickered, just slightly, her eyes dropping for a fraction of a second before lifting again, calculating, reassessing, searching for an angle that might still exist. Emily felt the shift ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, like the first crack in a surface that had appeared solid only moments before, and her heartbeat, which had been steady but heavy, began to change, not faster, but sharper, more focused, as if something inside her had recognized the opening. Daniel's voice came again, calm, precise. These records outlined financial transfers that were not disclosed during the initial filings. And the words hung in the air, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but heavy with implication. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, Emily saw uncertainty cross Richard's face, brief but undeniable, like a shadow passing over something carefully constructed. The room did not erupt. There were no raised voices, no sudden movements, only a tightening silence that carried more weight than any reaction could have, because everyone present understood that something had shifted, something fundamental, and Emily stood there, still, steady, her hand resting where it had always been, but now with a different kind of awareness, not just of what she had endured, but of what was beginning to surface, piece by piece, whether anyone was ready for it or not. For a moment, no one reached for the documents, as if touching them would confirm what everyone was beginning to suspect, and that hesitation stretched just long enough to make the silence feel intentional, heavy with consequence rather than confusion, until the courtroom doors opened once more and the judge entered, her presence restoring structure but not removing the tension that had already taken hold. She took her seat with practiced composure, her eyes scanning the room in a single sweep. That missed nothing, pausing briefly on the open folder before her gaze lifted again. And when she spoke, her tone was measured, calm, but edged with the authority that turned quiet into command. "Counsel, I understand there is new material to be addressed." And Daniel nodded once, not eager, not hesitant, simply certain, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Across the room, Richard straightened, adjusting his stance as though posture alone could re-establish control, his voice following quickly, precise and controlled. "Your Honor, we object to the introduction of any materials not previously disclosed." But the words landed differently now, less like a declaration and more like a delay, and even he seemed to recognize it in the slight tightening of his jaw. Daniel did not raise his voice when he responded, did not rush, because urgency was no longer necessary. "These records were obtained through a supplemental review completed late last night," he said, each word placed carefully, "and they directly relate to financial disclosures submitted under oath." And that phrase lingered, under oath, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but carrying a weight that shifted attention back to the documents resting on the table. The judge extended her hand, and for the first time, the papers were moved, lifted from the surface and placed before her, and as she began to review them, the room seemed to contract, every movement slowing, every breath measured, as if time itself had narrowed to the space between each page she turned. Emily stood where she had been, her posture steady, but something inside her had changed, something subtle but undeniable, like the difference between holding on and finally letting something surface, and she felt it in the way her shoulders settled, in the way her breath no longer caught at the edges, because this was no longer about what she had lost. It was about what was being revealed. Vanessa shifted again, more noticeably this time, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, her eyes moving between the judge and the documents with a focus that bordered on urgency. While Richard remained still, almost too still, as if movement itself might draw attention he could no longer control. Another page turned, then another, and the sound, soft as it was, seemed louder than anything else in the room, each one marking a step deeper into something that could not be undone. Daniel spoke again, his tone unchanged. The transfers originated from accounts that were not listed in the initial filings. He continued, and they were redirected through intermediary entities before being consolidated. And he paused there, not for effect, but because the implication no longer needed to be explained. The judge's expression did not shift dramatically. There was no visible reaction. But her focus sharpened, and when she finally looked up, it was not at Daniel, but at Richard, and that single glance carried more weight than any statement, because it was no longer a question of whether something existed, it was a question of what it meant. Emily felt the shift ripple outward again, stronger this time, more defined, and for the first time since she had stepped into that courtroom, she did not feel like she was standing alone at the center of it, because the narrative that had once surrounded her, quiet, controlled, and predetermined, was no longer holding its shape. It was changing, piece by piece, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if no one was ready to say it out loud. The judge did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more authority than any objection that had been raised moments earlier, her eyes returning to the documents as if confirming something she had already begun to understand. And when she finally set the final page down, the sound was quiet but definitive, the kind of sound that marked a shift no one in the room could ignore. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone even, controlled, but unmistakably focused. "These accounts were not disclosed in your original filings, and the statement did not rise into accusation. It did not need to, because the weight of it was already clear, already settled into the space between them." Richard inhaled slowly, his posture still composed, but the precision in his movements had changed, slightly less certain, as though the framework he relied on was beginning to loosen. "Your Honor, there may be a misunderstanding regarding the structure of certain holdings," he replied, his voice measured, professional, each word carefully placed as if language alone could rebuild what was shifting beneath him. But the explanation felt thinner now, less grounded, and even he seemed to recognize it in the brief pause that followed. Daniel remained still, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, because the strength of what had been presented did not rely on repetition, it relied on clarity. And clarity was already working its way through the room. Vanessa leaned forward, her composure intact but no longer effortless, her fingers tightening slightly where they rested, her gaze fixed on the documents as if searching for a detail she could use, a gap she could exploit, but none appeared, and that absence spoke louder than any argument she might have made. The judge turned another page, slower this time, her attention narrowing. These transfers appear to move through intermediary entities before consolidation. She continued, her voice steady, analytical, and they coincide with the timeline of this case. And there it was, not a conclusion, not yet, but a connection, one that could not be easily dismissed. Emily felt it settle in her chest, not as relief, not yet, but as recognition, something aligning in a way she had not allowed herself to expect, her hand still resting over her belly, her posture steady, but the tension that had once defined her presence now replaced by something quieter, something stronger, because this was no longer about proving her worth. It was about the truth revealing itself without her needing to force it into view. Richard's gaze shifted briefly, just once, toward Vanessa, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not resolve into strategy, did not settle into confidence, but instead lingered as uncertainty, the kind that spreads when control begins to slip beyond recovery. Daniel stepped forward then, not abruptly, but with intention. "Your Honor, there is an accompanying record of communications tied to these accounts," he said, placing a second set of documents beside the first, the motion precise, deliberate, and the addition changed the dynamic instantly. Because this was no longer about numbers alone, it was about context, about intent, about decisions that could not be explained away as oversight. The judge's expression remained composed, but her focus sharpened further, and when she looked up again, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if every person present had been drawn closer to the center of something they could no longer step away from. Emily did not move, did not speak, but something in her presence had shifted completely now, not louder, not more forceful, but undeniable, because the narrative that had once placed her on the edge of this moment had been pulled inward, reshaped, and in its place stood something far more difficult to dismiss, something that no longer needed defense, only space to be seen, and in that space, everything else was beginning to change. No one spoke when the second set of documents touched the table, and yet the shift was immediate, unmistakable, as if the room itself had recognized that this was no longer a matter of interpretation but of exposure, and the weight of it settled slowly, deliberately, pressing into every corner of the space until even the smallest movement felt amplified. The judge adjusted the stack with careful precision, her attention narrowing as she began to scan the first page, her eyes moving line by line, in a rhythm that seemed almost methodical, and with each second that passed, the quiet grew heavier, not empty, but filled with the kind of anticipation that does not need sound to build. Daniel did not speak again. He did not need to, because the material now existed independently of him, structured, organized, undeniable. And he understood that the most powerful thing he could do was allow it to unfold without interruption. Across the room, Richard's composure held, but it was no longer effortless. There was a tension beneath it now, subtle but present, like a structure absorbing stress it had not been designed to carry. And though his posture remained upright, controlled, there was a stillness to him that felt less like confidence and more like calculation, as if he were searching for a path that had not yet revealed itself. Vanessa's gaze moved quickly, sharper now, her earlier poise giving way to a more focused intensity, her attention darting between the judge and the documents as if she could anticipate what would be found before it was spoken aloud. But anticipation was no longer enough, because this was not a situation that could be redirected with timing or tone. Another page turned, and then another, each one marking a deeper layer. And when the judge finally paused, her fingers resting lightly against the paper, the room seemed to draw inward again, as if everything had been waiting for that exact moment. These communications reference coordinated transfers, she said, her voice steady, precise, but carrying a clarity that cut through the silence. And they appear to be linked directly to the accounts previously mentioned, and the phrasing was careful, measured, but the implication extended far beyond the words themselves. Emily felt it then, not as a surge, not as sudden relief, but as something steadier, something grounding, like the difference between holding on to uncertainty and finally standing on something that would not shift beneath her, her breath settling into a rhythm that felt more certain, more aligned with the moment unfolding in front of her. Richard stepped forward slightly, just enough to signal response, his voice following with controlled urgency. Your Honor, these interpretations may not fully reflect the intent behind standard financial structuring practices, he said, but the words, though carefully constructed, did not carry the same authority they once might have, because intent, once questioned, does not easily return to certainty. Daniel moved then, not quickly, but with purpose, placing a single page on top of the stack already before the judge, his motion precise, deliberate. This final document contains a time-stamped authorization tied to the originating account, he stated, his tone unchanged, calm, exact. And the addition did not escalate the moment. It clarified it, narrowing the space for interpretation until very little remained. Vanessa's composure shifted again, more noticeably this time, her shoulders tightening ever so slightly, her expression still controlled but no longer neutral, because the pattern that had once been obscured was now visible, and visibility is difficult to reverse once it has taken hold. The judge's eyes moved across the final page, slower now, more deliberate, and when she looked up again, the silence that followed was different from before, no longer anticipatory, but resolved, as if something had reached a point beyond which it could not be undone. And in that silence, Emily stood still, steady, not at the center of judgment, but at the edge of revelation, where truth does not need to be argued, only recognized. The silence that followed did not break. It settled, deep and immovable, like something final had already taken root before anyone dared to speak. And when the judge finally drew a slow breath, her posture unchanged, but her focus unmistakably sharpened, the entire room seemed to lean into that single moment, waiting not for drama, but for clarity, the kind that does not raise its voice yet changes everything it touches. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone even, controlled, but carrying a weight that no longer needed reinforcement. "This authorization appears to directly contradict your prior statements regarding the absence of these accounts." And the phrasing was careful, precise, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was no longer about possibility. It was about contradiction, and contradiction, once established, does not easily dissolve. Richard did not respond immediately, and that pause, brief as it was, carried more significance than any immediate defense could have, because it revealed something he had not shown before: hesitation, not uncertainty in knowledge, but an outcome, as if the path forward no longer followed the direction he had anticipated. When he did speak, his voice remained measured, but there was a shift beneath it, a tightening that suggested effort rather than ease. "Your Honor, there may be additional context that has not yet been fully presented," he said. But the statement lacked the grounding it once might have held, because context, when delayed, begins to feel less like explanation and more like reaction. Daniel remained composed, his presence steady, not pressing, not interrupting, because the moment no longer required force, it required space, and space was already doing the work. Vanessa's gaze moved again, quicker now, less controlled, her earlier confidence replaced by a focused alertness that bordered on urgency, her posture still aligned, but no longer relaxed, because the pattern unfolding in front of her was no longer theoretical. It was visible, structured, and increasingly difficult to redirect. The judge turned her attention back to the documents, her fingers resting lightly on the final page before lifting it once more, reviewing it with deliberate care. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different kind of finality, not louder, not sharper, but settled. "The timing of these transactions, combined with the communications provided, establishes a sequence that this court cannot disregard." And the statement did not escalate. It concluded, drawing a line that had not existed before. Emily felt the shift as something quiet but profound, not a sudden release, not a surge of emotion, but a steady alignment, as if something that had been misrepresented for so long was finally returning to its proper place. Her breath even, her posture unchanged, but her presence now grounded in something far more stable than expectation or fear. Richard's composure held, but only just, the precision in his stance now edged with strain. His gaze fixed forward, but no longer commanding the space the way it once had, because control, once questioned, does not fully return in the same form. Daniel stepped forward one final time, not to add, but to confirm. "Your Honor, we respectfully request that these materials be entered into the record for immediate consideration." And the request, simple as it was, carried the weight of everything that had led to this point, not as an escalation, but as a transition from revelation to consequence. The judge nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried the authority of decision, and in that moment, the room shifted again, not with tension this time, but with recognition, because something had been established that could not be undone, something that did not rely on opinion or interpretation, only on acknowledgement. Emily did not move, did not speak, but within her, something settled completely, not as victory declared, but as truth recognized. And sometimes, that is the moment that changes everything, not when the room reacts, but when it finally understands. The acknowledgement did not come with raised voices or sudden reactions. It arrived in the form of stillness, the kind that settles when everyone in the room realizes the direction has already changed, and as the judge's nod carried through the space like a quiet seal on everything that had just unfolded, the atmosphere shifted from tension to consequence, not explosive, not chaotic, but grounded, irreversible, and unmistakably real. Richard remained standing where he was, his posture still controlled, but the precision that once defined him now felt restrained, as if he were holding something in place rather than directing it forward. And for the first time, his silence did not suggest confidence, it suggested calculation that had run out of time, because the structure he had relied on was no longer responding the way it once had. Vanessa did not move immediately either, her composure still present, but thinner now, stretched across a moment that no longer supported it, her eyes no longer scanning for opportunity, but settling into something else entirely, recognition, not spoken, not admitted. But there in the way her focus narrowed and held. The judge adjusted the documents once more, aligning them. With deliberate care before speaking again, her voice steady, but now carrying the clarity of progression. These materials will be entered into the record, and further review will proceed with immediate consideration of their implications. And though the statement remained procedural, its impact was anything but routine, because it marked the transition from discovery to evaluation, from question to consequence. Daniel stepped back slightly, not retreating, but allowing the moment to expand. Without interference, his role no longer to introduce but to stand as the presence that had shifted the balance. And in that space, his calm became more visible, not passive, but assured, the kind that does not need to assert itself because it already understands the outcome is moving in its direction. Emily remained still, her hand resting where it had been from the beginning. But the meaning behind that stillness had changed completely, no longer protective, no longer bracing, but grounded. As if she were no longer standing against something, but standing within it, within the truth that had finally taken form around her. The room began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as if sound itself was. Testing whether it was safe to return, the quiet murmurs at the edges, the subtle shifts of posture, the slight movements that signaled the moment had passed its peak and settled into something more defined. Richard's gaze moved once more, briefly, toward the documents, then away, as though looking directly at them required an acknowledgement he was not prepared to give. And in that brief movement, the final trace of control seemed to slip, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough to change how he occupied the space he once commanded. Vanessa exhaled softly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders easing by a fraction, not in relief, but in adjustment, the kind that comes when resistance gives way to reality. And even in that small motion, the shift was clear, because confidence had been replaced with something quieter, something more measured, something that no longer led, but followed. The judge closed the folder with a soft, final motion, her attention lifting once more, and when she spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but definitive. We will proceed accordingly. And that was all. No elaboration, no emphasis, because none was needed. The direction had already been set. Emily did not look at Richard. She did not look at Vanessa. She simply stood, steady and composed, her presence no longer defined by what had been done to her, but by what had been revealed in front of everyone. And in that quiet, controlled moment, the kind that does not demand attention but holds it anyway, something settled into place, not as a victory declared, but as a truth that no longer needed to be hidden. And sometimes, that is the moment that changes everything, not when the world reacts, but when it finally sees. The room did not return to what it had been before, because moments like this do not reverse. They settle into place and reshape everything around them. And as the quiet instructions from the bench signaled the next phase of proceedings, the energy in the courtroom shifted from confrontation to consequence. A quieter, more deliberate tension that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Papers were gathered, notes were written, but no one rushed, no one disrupted the pace that had been set, because the direction was now clear, and clarity has a way of slowing everything down, forcing each person to absorb what could no longer be denied. Richard remained composed on the surface, but there was a distance in his focus now, a subtle withdrawal from the center of the room he once commanded, as if he were recalibrating not how to win, but how to respond. And that distinction, though quiet, was unmistakable. Vanessa adjusted her posture once more, her movements smaller now, more contained, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness, the kind that comes when every gesture is measured against a new reality. And even in her silence, the change was visible, because silence no longer carried control, it carried awareness. Daniel gathered the remaining documents with deliberate precision, not hurried, not theatrical, simply closing the sequence he had opened, and in doing so, he allowed the focus to remain where it belonged, not on him, but on what had been established. Emily felt the shift more clearly than anyone, not because she needed confirmation, but because she had lived the absence of it for so long, and now, standing in a space where the truth had been acknowledged without her needing to defend it, she recognized something deeper than relief, something steadier, a return to herself that did not depend on the room, but was reflected by it. The judge's voice carried again, outlining the next procedural steps, each word precise, grounded in the process that now had a different weight, because process, once filled with uncertainty, had been replaced with direction, and direction changes everything. A clerk moved quietly along the side, collecting copies, organizing what had been entered, and even that simple motion felt significant, because it marked the transition from moment to record, from something witnessed to something preserved. Richard finally spoke again, but his tone had shifted, less assertive, more contained, his words framed carefully, acknowledging procedure rather than challenging it. And in that adjustment, the difference was clear, because control had moved from assertion to compliance. Vanessa did not speak. She did not need to. Her stillness now more reflective than strategic, as if she understood that anything said in this moment would not reshape what had already taken form. Emily's gaze remained forward, steady, not seeking validation, not searching for reaction, because she no longer needed either. The room had already done what it needed to do. It had seen, it had recorded, it had begun to understand. And as the proceedings moved forward, not with drama, but with quiet inevitability, the significance of what had just occurred settled fully into place, not as an ending, but as a turning point, the kind that does not demand attention but holds it long after the moment has passed. Because once the truth is placed into the record, it does not fade. It remains, shaping everything that comes next. And in that steady, unspoken way, Emily stood not as someone who had been pushed aside, but as someone who had remained long enough for the truth to finally stand beside her. The proceedings continued, steady and methodical, but the outcome no longer felt uncertain. It felt like something that had already taken shape beneath the surface and was now simply being acknowledged step by step. And as the final procedural statements were recorded, the room began to shift once more, not with tension, not with anticipation, but with closure, the kind that settles quietly, without announcement, but leaves nothing unchanged. The judge concluded the session with a calm directive, her tone unchanged yet carrying a finality that required no emphasis. And as the gavel came down, not loud, not dramatic, but precise, it marked the end of something that had been unfolding long before this day began. Chairs moved softly against the floor, papers were gathered, conversations resumed at a low murmur, but none of it returned the room to what it had been before. Because what had been seen could not be unseen, what had been entered into record could not be removed. And that understanding lingered in every glance, every quiet exchange, every measured step toward the exit. Richard did not speak immediately. He remained where he was for a moment longer than necessary, his posture still composed but no longer centered, as if the space itself had shifted away from him. And when he finally turned, his movements were controlled, deliberate, but different, not leading, not directing, simply following the path available to him now. Vanessa rose without a word, her expression composed but restrained, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet awareness that did not seek attention. And as she moved beside him, there was no exchange between them, no visible strategy, only the shared understanding of a moment that had altered more than either of them had anticipated. Daniel closed his folder with the same precision he had maintained from the beginning, his presence steady, not triumphant, not expressive, because the work had never been about display, it had been about clarity, and clarity had already done what it needed to do. Emily remained where she stood for a brief moment longer, her hand resting gently over her belly, her posture unchanged. But everything about her presence now carried a different weight, not heavy, not burdened, but grounded, as if something that had once been uncertain within her had settled into place completely. She did not look toward Richard. She did not look toward Vanessa, because she no longer needed to measure herself against them. The room had already shifted that balance without her asking for it. When she finally moved, her steps were slow, careful, but steady, each one placed with a quiet confidence that did not seek recognition, only direction. And as she walked toward the exit, the path in front of her felt clearer than it had in a long time, not because everything had been resolved, but because what mattered had been revealed. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, not because the world had changed, but because she had, because standing in that room had not required her to fight, to prove, to argue. It had only required her to remain, and sometimes that is where the real strength lives, not in forcing a moment, but in holding steady until the moment reveals itself. Behind her, the doors closed with a soft, final sound, sealing the space where everything had shifted. And as Emily stepped forward into the hallway, into the light that filtered through the high windows, she did not look back, not out of avoidance, but out of certainty, because the past had already spoken for itself, and the future did not require permission to begin. And in that quiet, controlled way, the kind that does not demand attention but stays with you long after the moment has passed, the truth settled into place, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something undeniable, the kind that does not need to be defended once it has finally been seen. Because some people lose control of everything they built, not in a single moment, but in the moment the truth no longer chooses to stay hidden, and when that happens, nothing they hold on to can keep it from being known.